Where does Hublot actually stand today? Has it gone through a remarkable evolution like some other brands, or has it stayed with what it has always done? This question actually came up when a friend of mine, now working at the Hublot boutique, asked what I think about their latest releases. And the truth is, I didn't have an answer because it has been over 15 years since I last worked with Hublot. So, following that, I picked a watch of my choice and tested it for a week, and this is exactly how today's video actually came together, which will answer the question of where Hublot stands today and whether a purchase is today worth considering. Hello and welcome back to Watchmaker. Nick here, and today I'm excited about today's hands-on review of the Hublot Big Bang Unico, because after a full week on the wrist, this watch gave me a very clear perspective on Hublot's evolution and the direction the brand is moving in. Now, the three changes I noticed and where I think Hublot has made the biggest updates are the design, the quality, and most importantly, the engineering, particularly the movement. But for now, let's speak quickly about the design, which was the very first thing that caught my attention. Well, my last impression of Hublot, if I think back, was a brand defined by a very bold design language combined with materials that weren't really used in watchmaking before. And yes, it was exactly this combination that created a lot of attention back then and gave the brand a very strong recognition. But I think the issue was that, first of all, the variety was extremely broad. The use of color was often very prominent, and overall, the design was, let's say, quite striking for the average everyday wearer. Today, things look a bit different, even though there are still some bold colors here and there. They are used much more sparingly, but overall, the selection feels more refined and streamlined with a stronger focus on a calmer, more restrained design language compared to the past. Interestingly, I noticed this calmer look immediately when I visited the boutique, and the more refined, cohesive assortment actually made it much easier to choose a watch for this video, because I feel like when the difference in style and color are less extreme, the decision becomes a lot simpler. And today's watch, if you look at it, really sums this up. It still carries the Hublot DNA, but in a far more refined and detail-oriented way, rather than being driven by bold design features and daring colors. For example, the watch I have here uses black ceramic finished with both polished and microblasted surfaces to create contrast rather than mixing different materials. And you can really see it in the execution, where the design feels far more cohesive and controlled, so nothing feels out of place and everything works together much better than I remember from 15 years ago. But another thing I noticed while wearing it was just how comfortable it felt on the wrist. And this really comes down not only to the well-executed geometry of the case, strap and clasp, but also to its lightweight construction. And from my experience, discomfort usually comes from poor case geometry or simply weak execution. And surprisingly, that is something I have come across more often than not with other watches. That's why I think it is fair to highlight the ergonomics here, because in the world of watches, this is still not a given, even at this price point. Now, I think after design, one thing that of course matters regardless of the brand is the quality, and I was really eager to take a closer look at the quality of today's Hublot watches in detail. That's why, by the way, I used the 90mm macro lens with 2 or even 4 times magnification to better put these details into perspective. So here's what I noticed while shooting. First of all, I think there is a general misunderstanding when it comes to quality, because depending on who you ask, the meaning can vary completely. But what actually is quality? Well, in my world, or in the world of watchmaking, quality is quite simple. It means the watch performs reliably under all conditions without compromise. It is flawless in terms of its visual execution, meaning there are no imperfections, no marks or irregularities. Lastly, it is built with a level of precision and durability that ensures long-term reliability and the consistency in performance. So when it comes to this piece I had with me for a week, I really pushed it quite hard, repeatedly testing all the functions in different situations, from the chronograph to the time setting and the date adjustment. But honestly, there was not even the slightest hint of any deviation and nothing remotely close to a malfunction. But on the contrary, I have to really mention how extremely smooth and light the chronograph operates, responding instantly to start, stop and the flyback function, which is indeed a very important characteristic of a good chronograph. But what also stood out is that even when you start the chronograph, the hand moves forward immediately without that small backward jump you often see in other chronographs before they engage. And by the way, why this works so effectively on this watch is something I only discovered later, and it turns out to be a deliberate feature of the movement, which I will explain in more detail shortly. But in general, I have to really say that all the functions felt smooth throughout my testing period. And one feature that especially deserves praise is their quick change strap system, which is incredibly simple and easy to use. And yes, I have to mention it again because many of the so-called quick change systems out there can actually be quite frustrating and sometimes felt like you need a science degree just to operate them. But beyond the functional quality, I also really went looking for imperfections at extreme macro distances, because I really did not want to leave anything to chance and out of curiosity. I wanted to see just how far the finishing of Hublot watches really goes. And as it turns out, there was truly nothing that could have concerned me, which is also to be expected for a watch in this price range. Now, one last thing needs to be checked in order to get my watchmaker's approval, which is where Hublot stands today in terms of in-house movements. But before we get into the next section, take a quick break, get some fresh air or grab a cup of coffee, because what's coming up next is going to be quite technical, but it is also where things become really interesting. The really exciting thing about this watch is that to fully understand the movement, you have to look at the dial side and not just the back, because Hublot has really used both sides to the maximum for the movement, which makes exploring this movement a fascinating journey. First, we have a fully integrated chronograph, which is important to highlight because, as I have mentioned many times in my previous videos, whether a complication is integrated or not has a huge impact on the freedom you have in terms of engineering and features. And I think today's movement is a prime example, because when a complication is integrated, it means the entire movement is designed around it from the very beginning, and every step of the development takes the complication and its features into account rather than adding it later on. But it also gives you a full control over the movement's dimensions, especially thickness and diameter, since every component is planned together rather than stacked or added later. So for no surprise, we have here a flyback chronograph movement in height of only 6.75 millimeter, which is at the level of the Rolex 4130, which, by the way, does not have a flyback function. Same as the Rolex 4130, this chronograph is also built around the 4 Hz bitrate, which still delivers a remarkable 3-day power reserve using a single barrel. And I think this is already an achievement, because typically the higher the bitrate, the shorter the power reserve. Of course, what certainly helps maintain this high power reserve is the silicone escapement, which is another feature worth highlighting and already sets a very high standard before we even got into the real details. Now, let's look at the chronograph mechanism, and the first thing you notice is the column wheel, which is visible on the dial side at 6 o'clock, while most watches hide the column wheel at the back. And no, it's not only to allow the wearer to enjoy this when starting the chronograph, but actually also for engineering purposes, because the column wheel is positioned exactly between the two pushers at 2 and 4 o'clock. So by centering it at 6 o'clock on the dial side, the levers that connect the pushers to the column wheel can be shorter and more direct. So now let's speak a bit about the clutch system, which is really something else here and truly fascinating, because Hublot took the horizontal clutch to the next level, because they didn't just use a regular horizontal clutch. They introduced a dual horizontal clutch, but let me explain in simple terms. So usually you have one single clutch within a chronograph which does everything. It means it has to drive the seconds hand of the chronograph and the minute counter of the chronograph at the same time. Hublot solved this by giving the seconds hand and the minute their own independent clutches, where one of them is visible at 9 o'clock while the other is behind the bridge at around 2 o'clock. So by using two separate oscillating clutches, what they have done is they have split the workload, means the second counter and the minute counter, they both have their own dedicated path. So since they are not fighting for the same energy, the movement of course stays perfectly stable while the chronograph is running. Because the thing is, usually a chronograph uses a tiny pin or a thin rod as the clutch, but the problem is that this pin has a very little contact surface, so it can slip, jump, or wear down over time. So this means engagement isn't smooth. The second hand can jump when you start the chronograph, and the whole mechanism is more prone to inaccuracy or wear. By contrast, Hublot replaced it with a full-size gear wheel and with a larger contact surface that's always spinning in sync with the main gear train. So this makes the engagement much smoother, more precise, and far more reliable. Now the thing is, for this wheel to even work, the gears have to be produced using LEGO technology, where the teeth, if you look close, are designed to be slightly flexible and spring-loaded. And the reason is this allows precise alignment with the chronograph seconds wheel without clashing. So when you press the start, the gear does not crash into place, but instead soft lands, eliminating or minimizing the second hand jump that you typically see in most horizontal chronographs. Now, as if all of that wasn't enough, Hublot did something really clever. They powered the minute counter through a separate gear train directly linked to the barrel. This means the minute counter has its own dedicated energy path, while the chronograph second remains driven by the main timekeeping gear train, as we can see here. And this also explains why we have two wheels on top of the barrel instead of one, because the wheel below is driving the gear train, while the wheel on top is actually for the minute counter of the chronograph. So by connecting the minute counter straight to the barrel, Hublot gave it its own dedicated power source, which is like giving the trailer its own engine, so the car doesn't feel the weight. The result is the transition is incredibly smooth and the watch maintains its perfect accuracy, whether the chronograph runs for 1 minute or 10 hours. But besides these features that are important to the wearer, I really like how Hublot also thought about serviceability and the watchmaker. Because we have here an escapement module which is removable, and the patented adjustment screw which allows fine-tuning of the chronograph hand friction without removing the movement from the case, which is another great feature of this movement. But even the balance wheel regulator is LEGO fabricated, elastic, and eliminates play, making regulation precise and more straightforward. And finally, we have the winding system, which was redesigned compared to the Unico one, because Hublot moved away from the thicker magic lever to a more compact bi-directional system with ceramic ball bearings, further reducing thickness without compromising robustness. Now, after everything I have seen today, I'm genuinely impressed, especially when it comes to the engineering behind the movement. And keep in mind, we're talking about a brand founded in the 80s, so still quite young in watchmaking terms. But let me be honest, I'm left a bit conflicted, because I keep asking myself why, for instance, this movement does not get the same attention or hype it probably would if a brand like Rolex had created it. But this realization brings me to the closing thoughts and my final verdict for today's review. Look, the thing with the movement here is I have to admit that to truly appreciate the engineering behind, you need either first-hand experience or a more advanced understanding of watchmaking. And that is likely one of the reasons why the achievement behind this movement goes over some people's heads. On the other hand, this also shows a bit of the imbalance within the watch community when it comes to recognition and praise. Because as I said, if one of the hyped brands had done even half of what Hublot achieved with this movement, I'm pretty sure people would have gone mad. This also shows that often the praise or criticism a brand receives is not consistent, since it is not applied using the same rules or logic across different brands, eventually making it more opinion than fact. And yes, I understand that many people reviewing watches online talk about pieces they have never actually seen in person, or judge technical features without the proper background to assess them, and often distorting reality or even completely missing it. That's why I was really happy to review this watch today from a neutral, fact-based perspective, drawing on more than 20 years of first-hand experience in the watch industry. I know some people are already typing, you got paid to promote it, and the funny thing is, comments like that only appear when facts challenge a perspective that was built purely on opinion. And this watch is a prime example because it really offers much more than people usually talk about, and the kind of details I'm highlighting are only revealed when you take a closer hands-on look. So what we have here are not just features that look good or sound fancy, but these are features that truly have a significant and measurable impact for both the wearer and the watchmaker. So to answer the question we started this video with, where Hublot stands today, and based on what I have seen, let me tell you this. If Hublot continues with the design language they are using today and approaches the rest of their in-house movement development with the same inventive spirit and engineering creativity, the future of the brand looks very exciting. With that said, that's it for today, and I hope this video has introduced you to something new, or sparked some inspiration, or brought you closer to technical features you weren't aware of. If you have any questions about what I've covered today, or if there is something specific about watches you would like to know, feel free to reach out at any time. In the meantime, if you haven't already, hit the like button and subscribe for more watchmaking related content. But for now, as always, stay blessed and see you next time.